Latch the windows, lock the doors, and put the kids to bed. It's time for another episode of
Tales from the Garage.
Okay, guys, I'm back. Man, I've had a lot of problems. I don't know what's wrong with this computer. This is an old Windows 7 computer. I've never had any problems until recently recording videos. This is now my fourth attempt. Fourth. You have to excuse me, my voice is a little messed up. I should never eat crackers before I try to do a video, and I always do, and I always got they're dry and they get stuck in my throat. And this is my second attempt tonight at doing this video, and my fourth attempt overall. So since my last Tales from the Garage, I've attempted to record 3 times now. The next take, the next version of Tales from the Garage, next episode, and the computer hasn't gone along with it. And on 2 of the occasions, I spoke for 38 minutes, and I hit the end record button, which should create the file. And when it creates the file, instead, it creates a blank file and wipes out the 38 minutes that I was just speaking. So I may try to do it differently tonight. So you might notice there's probably going to be edits. I think I'm going to record in segments. So it's going to jump, and there's nothing I can do about it. I'll connect the pieces so that it's seamless for the viewers, but the whole thing is going to jump because I'm going to have to sew it together, I guess. So to start with, I just want to say thanks to Carm, who's over time has sent me several times. He sent me various incense that I've always been hesitant to burn because once you burn them, you no longer have them. I love incense. I love the way they smell, and the ones that he sent me all had such a strong scent that I would just open the bag and kind of run around the room shaking the bag to get the scent in the room. But since the last video, whenever that was, a week or so ago, I've actually come out here and I've been burning them, actually lighting them, and I have them going now. And I noticed something I always knew, but you kind of forget until you light them again. What a nice atmosphere it creates. It would be great for creative work because, I don't know, I just relax when the scent's going on and I smell it. It just creates a nice vibe. It's kind of hard to be stressed. And I think, well, that'd be really good for creative endeavors, especially out here where there's no windows. So already, the one advantage that I had, because I record inside the condo where there's windows, obviously, and I've in the past also recorded out here, my music, and I've always kind of noticed that the one benefit out here is there's no windows, not only outside, but into the rest of the condo. So it's kind of hopefully not claustrophobic, but it's very man cave-ish, and it's kind of better for concentrating. And so there's only artificial light out here, and I just noticed that since I've been burning the incense, how what a nice vibe it creates. And I'm thinking that'd be really good for creative work, and I imagine as it would be for sculptors or painters or something like that, who probably all these people that have their own little mini studios wherever, in their home or away from home, and they maybe try to create the ideal atmosphere to create in. And probably guys like that put on music for the background, at least the creative folks that I know that painting and things like that are very big on having certain music play to use to inspire them. So I have the incense going. So it's mellowing me out a bit more. So as for my third or fourth attempt now at recording the next video, I did select randomly 3 vinyls. And usually in the past, when it didn't work for me to do another Tales from the Garage, when the computer wouldn't cooperate, I would put the vinyls back to be selected randomly at some point in the future. This time I decided I'm just going to leave the vinyls out. I did randomly select them though, just not tonight, and speak about them otherwise. So I think I'm going to start and do an edit after I speak about the first, actually the third album, because it's the one I need to talk about the least. The third album that I selected randomly the other night was Eberhard Weber's ECM, of course, Colors, Silent Feet, which is the second album of the three that Colors made. Now, a lot of people name this as their favorite Colors album. And, you know, my preference was actually for one. I think I randomly selected Little Movements, which was the last and third one that was recorded in 1980, I believe. That's my personal favorite. It's also the first one that I bought of the Colors band, and actually of Eberhard Weber's. So I don't know. I never know if that preference has something to do with it. The fact that it was the first one. But Colors is an excellent band. This is their second album, and I've read that a lot of people have this as their favorite. A fantastic band. John Marshall did come along on drums and replace John Christensen, who played on the group's first album called Yellow Fields. But that was the only personnel change that the group had during their time. It's a quartet. Only 3 long tracks on here. There's 2 12-minute tracks and one track that's 17 minutes and 47 seconds that takes up all of side 1. That's quite a nice journey, that track, called Seriously Deep. This was recorded November 77, so it would have come out in early 1978. And on paper, if you don't look too closely, it seems like it might be a fairly standard jazz quartet lineup in terms of the musicians. Bass drums, keyboards, and saxophone. But there's quite a bit more going on than that. Firstly, we have Eberhard Weber's upright electric bass, which kind of has a slightly different sound quality than either the standard upright or the standard acoustic upright or the standard electric bass, electric guitar bass. And there's the acoustic drums, but there's also Rainier Bruninghaus, who's the keyboard player, who's fantastic, who, in addition to playing piano, is playing synthesizers as well. And I've said this in the past, I've always liked his choices of patches and sounds that he uses on synthesizers. Maybe some people would disagree, but to me, they never sound dated. I mean, this is the analog period. This is late 70s. So you're talking about that kind of synthesizer technology then, but it's actually my favorite period for synthesizer sounds. Those old, fat analog sounds sound great. And Rainier Bruninghaus always had a good ear for selecting what went right. And a lot of it is, I guess you could say, a lot of string sounds, so supportive, almost like a string backdrop sound, which is very nice. One thing I never get tired of, there's not a sameness to the sound throughout the album because of the various sounds of the electric keyboards being used in conjunction with the piano. And also the fact that Charlie Mariano, the late great Charlie Mariano, my favorite saxophone player, also plays wood flutes on here as well. So there's some nice variations in tone and settings used. I don't know if it's called it quite a world music vibe, but almost the wood flutes remind me of maybe like a almost like Japanese flutes. You know, the type of wood flutes that Japanese music uses. It's got that effect on it, so it's not just saxophone. So there's not a sameness to the sound, and this is a good place, I think, for people that don't know Eberhard Weber really to start to appreciate his music. A little more accessible because there are drums and there's a rhythm section and standard improvising, whereas some of Eberhard's other albums are more compositional and don't have any percussion at all. No traditional rhythm section, or they may be solo bass albums, which, you know, it's a certain kind of person, I guess, that can listen to a solo bass album. So this is one of his more, I think, accessible things for people kind of diving in or people not really familiar with avant-garde jazz. Excellent album. I'm glad I have. Of course, I have it on CD. And there's the group. There's the guys. as they were. Actually, they're all still with us except Charlie Mariano there all the way on the right. Okay, segment 2 here. This next album I selected randomly earlier, was another ECM. No big surprise there. Mike Nock, the pianist from New Zealand, I believe, originally. This is, I'm trying to think, I believe this is his only ECM album. Recorded November 1981, which means it came out in early 82. Funny because the previous album, the Edward Weber album, was also recorded in November, but of 77, so I got a bit of a November vibe thing going here. This is an excellent album. I bought it because it was ECM. I knew nothing about Mike Nock at the time, but by early 1982, I was already an ECM fanatic. And I was familiar with the two supporting players. This is a standard, what looks like a standard piano trio with upright bass and drums, and the upright bass is done by two people that I was already familiar with, so I thought, how could I go wrong? And that's Eddie Gomez on upright bass, John Christensen, my favorite drummer, on drums. So how could I not go for it? So I bought it not knowing anything about Mike Nock. And it was, it's funny, of course, at the time you didn't have the internet, so it literally took me decades to learn anything about Mike Nock apart from the music on the albums of his that I have. And it's a very interesting, it's strictly acoustic piano, there's no other synthesizers or keyboards, which in the past Mike Nock, I guess in the late 70s he was playing electric keyboards as well. But it seems like by the early 80s he had dropped them, and I don't see any of his albums from this point on utilizing anything besides acoustic piano anymore. So it seemed like he kind of backed off, as I've seen other jazz musicians do, backed off of the electric keyboards. Paul Bley was one of them, but he did return to electric keyboards for one album, I seem to recall, that was done in the late 80s or early 90s. But so far, and Mike Nock is still out there recording away, I've not seen or heard of Mike returning to a format where he uses electric keyboards. Now, with a upright bass and drums and acoustic piano setup, you might think kind of jazz or bebop-derived music, but it's not. In fact, it's pretty dark stuff. There's not a lot of bebop in there. If any, maybe occasionally you might hear some jazz harmonies to the piano, to the keyboards, but for the most part, I would say, on first hearing for anybody, whether they knew Mike or not, it's probably more of a European classical influence that he has. And the music's dark, but not in a kind of scary way. It's really actually well done, and it's quite original. And oddly enough, now I've got one earlier album by him from the late 70s where he does use electric keyboards, which I believe, doing this by memory, I'm pretty sure John Abercrombie plays on that one. And I have several later albums also done with a piano, bass, drums trio, and also solo piano albums. He seems to, most of his recording sessions nowadays seem to go between the two. It's either a solo piano thing or it's a piano, bass, drums trio. Now, Mike Nock is actually originally from New Zealand, which took me ages and ages and ages to learn. But he was living in New York, or actually New Jersey, for a while at the time that this album came out. Now, don't ask me how I remember this or how I found this out, because, like I said, the internet didn't exist. But shortly after this album came out, I had read somewhere, I guess, that Mike Nock was living in New Jersey. And what I found out even much later was that one of the reasons that he was living in the U.S. at that time was he was doing apparently a lot of sessions in New York. Well, I don't think those sessions exist so much anymore, but I believe he was doing like commercial sessions, which would all be done probably in Los Angeles now. But that one of the ways I guess he was earning a living while living here in the U.S. in the late 70s was by doing, I guess, commercials or various things where he was a paid musician, I guess, playing parts that were read. For the life of me, though, I can't remember how I found out that he was living in New Jersey. And my musical partner at the time, Frank, and I had recorded a demo tape that we wanted to send to ECM in Germany. And at the time, ECM Records was distributed by Warner Brothers. If you could see the Warner Brothers logo at the bottom of the album there. And you could send demos to ECM in New York at the Warner Brothers address there, but I didn't think they wouldn't get listened or forwarded to ECM, I don't think. They'd probably get listened to by Warner Brothers guys, which I didn't want. So I wanted to send our demo tape to ECM in Germany, but didn't have an address. So, and I don't know how I heard that Mike Knock was living in New Jersey at the time, but I called information and actually got his number, which I don't think you could do now without knowing what town he lived in. I don't think I knew what town he lived in. It wasn't in my area, I seem to recall. And even though I'm really close to New York City, for some reason I don't think he was living in my area. And we called him out of the blue, and it turns out he was a really nice guy. Called him in the middle of the day, like in the afternoon, some weekday. Totally at random, he answered the phone. And we kind of identified ourselves as being, I guess musicians, and we wanted to submit a demo tape. And, we knew his music through the ECM label, and we liked it and all that. But how many people would really be responsive to a random call from a stranger like that? He was really nice, though. And don't ask me why I thought that he would even know what the address of ECM in Germany was, just because he had recorded for them. He didn't need to have their address. If he's going to receive any kind of payments for his albums, they're going to come to him through the mail or whatever. But oddly enough, he had the address, and he gave it to us in Germany. And we sent our demo tape to Germany as a result of speaking to Mike Knock and our random telephone call. Really nice guy. And ever since then, I've been an even bigger fan, because he was just so nice to these guys that called that he didn't know, randomly got his phone number out of the book, and we never did bother him again. Now, I don't know how long he stayed in the States. I want to say, and that was the early 80s, because that was right after this album came out. But apparently he's lived in Australia now for quite some time. So he's a real global trotter. And I guess as a lot of musicians are, and a lot of musicians will go, I guess where the work is, or where it's easy for them to get club gigs or studio gigs or whatever it is they're looking for to get by. But I don't know. That's something that's always intrigued me of all the musicians that I like, is how they end up where they end up in terms of where they're living. Is it solely economic? Is it because they like the vibe of a certain country or city or something? It's always very interesting to me how these guys move around so much. And especially Mike Knock, who's lived in the U.S. and New Zealand and Australia. And those are only the three places that I know of. And that's quite global hopping around there. I think of that of other guys too. Eberhard Weber, who's German, has apparently lived in France for some time, as of Bar Phillips, the American bass player who's lived there in France for decades. And I just wonder what their choice is, what their selection is. And especially in the case of those two guys who at one point in their lives did tour and play all around the world. And how those two bass player composers, which are two of my favorite musicians, ended up deciding they were going to live in France, of all places. And what it is about that place that makes them want to be there. That's always been something interesting to me. So that's it for the Mike Knock album. If you find it, and you can get it, and you're interested in a really nice piano trio that's a little dark, it's all original music written by Mike Knock. If you can find it, I highly recommend it. It's called Ondas, Ondas. Great album. Really, really nice album. Okay, and the third album of my selection. and mind you, I am doing this in bits and pieces, is a John Scofield album. No, it's not an ECM recording. This was actually the first random album that I selected, but I saved it for last, only because the stories are longer for this one. So, here's an album recorded live. This is a live album. This is my first John Scofield album that I ever picked up, called Shinola, a live album recorded in December of 1981, which, like the previous album, means that it would have come out early in 1982. And it's a trio, as you can see, with John Scofield on electric guitar, Steve Swallow on electric bass, and Adam Nussbaum on drums. I think this is the first place I heard Adam Nussbaum, but I can't be sure. I think it was. Scofield on electric guitar. It's a guitar-bass drums trio. Live recording. About a year later, maybe even less than a year later, they released a second volume. This is short. This is, like one of those 37-minute albums or something like that. Very short. So obviously, the gig ran a lot longer than that, and they released a second album, which, doing this from memory, I think it was called Out Like a Light, which was from the same live performances. It was an album that they released maybe about a year after this came out. Pretty much Scofield originals with one Jackie McLean tune called Dr. Jackal, which I believe Miles Davis also recorded at one point. Dr. Jackal was a track that was picked up and played by a lot of jazz musicians. And this is a period shortly before. Now, this was the first Scofield. I had heard of Scofield, but I hadn't heard of any of his records yet at this point. I believe that he started recording solo albums in the late 1970s, and he only had a few albums out under his own name at this point, maybe 3 or 4, and the record store had a few of them. But the reason I chose this one, well, it was a new release at the time, but not having really heard Scofield yet, I decided on this one because I was already an ECM fan and a Steve Swallow fan through Steve Swallow's solo albums on ECM, but also his many appearances playing with Gary Burton. So I bought this as my first Scofield album. Plus, it's just a live date, so you get that nightclub vibe to it. Interesting. Scofield's always had interesting sound to his guitar. Now here, this is actually probably the preferred way in terms of his sound. He's got a very kind of dull, dry sound that he uses today. He must be hearing it differently than I hear it, because the sound that he uses today it's not radically different from what you hear on this album, but it's different enough that makes me think, well, gee, if I were an engineer, I'd be throwing some reverb on that guitar or something. But it's the way he likes it, I guess, and it's certainly, you can tell it's him playing, not just from the playing style itself, but from the sound to his electric guitar. In between this, though, shortly after this period, Miles Davis hired him, so he was playing with Miles Davis in Miles Davis's early to mid 80s bands for a couple years, and Miles had him playing a much more processed fusion-y type guitar sound, and that was as per Miles' request. And so even after John left Miles, he kept that more processed fusion sound for a while. Here, he's got an interesting, it's a combination between a very clean guitar tone with just a slight hint of distortion. It's very interesting because it's not a combination that I can recall hearing other guitarists use. They either use much more distortion or go totally clean. And here it's kind of a clean sound with just the slightest hint, almost like he was using a tiny guitar amp with everything turned up to 10, so it was pushing the sound and causing it to distort a slight bit. A very interesting sound he had here, I thought. At this time, in between this album and the next one that came out from the 2 live sessions, John was playing concerts to promote the album, I guess, shortly after this came out, I discovered that he was playing in a club that was a few towns away from me, maybe 20 minutes at most away from where I lived. The place was a pain in the ass to get to, but it's a club that's not there anymore called, I believe it was called Struggles, and I believe it was run by a husband and wife team. And it was a strange club in its location on a corner. The entry door was you had a corner of a street, and the building the front door to the club was right where the corner met. So, and the building wasn't square; it was kind of rounded at the edges, so that at this corner, and where the door was right at the corner where these two streets met. It's kind of a strange setup, and there was other businesses that shared this building. So it was an oddball little place, and when you walked in, it was a little bit narrower at the entry point because that's kind of where the corner of the streets met. And then as you looked down the club got wider, and at the back of the club, all the way at the back, was the stage. And I mean a mini stage. And the funny thing is, I don't even know how the hell they got that to be a jazz club because it was so small that I can't see the stage fitting more than 4 people. And yet everybody played there that went through there. At that point, there wasn't a lot of jazz clubs around. It was just outside New York City, but still people would hit it, people would hit it that would still and play there that would potentially play in New York City nightclubs as well, even though the New York City nightclubs were just another 10 minutes away or maybe a little more. Interesting place though. And I remember, and I seem to, this number sticks out in my memory because I seem to remember at one point reading that the club had a capacity of about 75 people, and I can still picture. I only went there, I think once, possibly twice, but I think I only went there that one time to see Schofield, and I still have as vivid a memory as if I had taken a picture of the place, of what it looked like. The standard round little tables that could fit maybe 4 people, but not very big, and I guess maybe the 75 person capacity was probably sounded correct to me. And so it wasn't a big club, and you could never have a rock band playing there, for instance. But nice, intimate, not a bad seat in the house. Went there with my buddy Frank, who hadn't even heard the Schofield album yet, but at that point we were going to a lot of concerts anyway. And I told him about this, and he was primarily interested because it was a promotion for the album, so Adam Nussbaum and Steve Swallow were scheduled to perform. And Frank, as well as myself, were already ECM fans, and kind of, I think the big push for Frank, and for me as well, really was to go see Steve Swallow play. Because Steve, I don't know to what extent he ever did really solo shows, and he plays with Carla Bley a lot, but I don't know to what extent Steve ever went out and did tours of his own band with him as a leader. So, and we had Steve's many ECM recordings at that point. So we went to the concert only to find out Steve Swallow didn't make it. And I remember asking at the time what happened. And I think it was just simple, like he came down with the flu or something like that. But in his place, they had, instead of the electric bass, which Steve Swallow played, they had a guy named Ron McClure. I had heard of Ron McClure, but I don't think I had ever heard him play on anything. Now, he was, besides being a jazz musician, a studio musician. So he would record for many pop bands and R&B bands or whatever as a studio musician. But I don't think I'd ever actually heard him play on anything that I'm aware of. And the nice thing about Ron McClure filling in for Steve Swallow was that instead of being an electric bassist, he was an upright bass player. Well, my buddy Frank, who came along to the show, had just switched from electric bass to upright. So in a way, that was an even bigger plus, because now he could get up close and kind of see a real jazz upright bass player and do his thing. And it was nice. You would never know that Ron McClure was a fill-in guy I don't know how much rehearsal they got, but I would have never guessed that that the three of those guys hadn't been playing together for quite a long time. From what I recall, memory could be faulty, but I don't think it was. I don't think it is. The band did 3 sets of about 45 minutes, which we stayed for all 3. And at each set they played 3 songs. So that'll tell you how much they stretched out. So you're talking about 15 minutes per song, which sounds about right in terms of what I recall. Obviously, a lot of long guitar solos, a lot of long bass solos, and drum solos as well. Quite interesting to see. I don't even think they adapted that approach simply because Ron McClure was a fill-in bass player. I get the feeling that if Steve Swallow had been there, it would have been the same in terms of how much they stretched out on the material. After the first or second set, I'm not sure. I think it was the first set. The band was taking breaks in between, and they would disappear behind this tiny, tiny little stage. And as a matter of fact, it's interesting that Scofield had such minimal equipment. He just had one single electric guitar and a very small guitar amp. About that big, and about that tall or something like that. Very familiar to, and I've got one the same size sitting right at my feet, but I can't get the camera down there. More of the kind of thing that electric guitarists use for practice, but in a jazz club, it was actually loud enough. And Scofield had it sitting on a chair so that it was perched a little bit higher, closer to his ears so he could hear, because with an amplifier that small, if it's down on the ground just projecting out front, he probably couldn't hear it well enough to really hear what he was doing. So he had it perched up on a bar stool, which was kind of cool, and kind of tilted a little bit so he could hear it better. But that was it, the minimal equipment. I guess the bass may have been mic'd through a very, very small overhead kind of PA system, because I don't remember seeing any bass amp or anything for the upright bass. And I don't think the drum, this is how small the club was, I'm fairly sure the drums were not mic'd at all. Just what you heard was coming off the stage. That's how small the place was. So the band would play their 45-minute set and disappear, walk out the back of the stage and take a break. And I realized that, I don't know, as small as the club was, I don't think the musicians' back room there, just because of the construction of the building, would have had any windows or anything. I think it was very small, and because there were businesses attached to the building behind it, I don't think there was any way that there could have been any windows. So what I discovered is Frank and myself decided to take a break and just go out for some fresh air in between the band's sets. So we walked out the front door, which was the only door to the club, and that we knew of, only to discover all 3 of the band musicians, Scofield and Adam Nussbaum and Ron McClure, standing right there. And it was like, didn't expect to run into them, which gave us the opportunity to talk a little bit to them. And I remember asking what happened to Steve Swallow, and I don't really recall the answer, but it was something simple, like I believe he had come down with the flu or something. And so I got to talk to Ron McClure a little bit as well. As a fill-in bass player, now, we had noticed when he was playing that he had a bow for the bass that was there's a little pouch that attaches to an upright bass so that you can store your bow, but he hadn't used it at all during the whole first set. And so I asked him, because I knew, especially my buddy Frank, who was just really starting out on the upright bass, and he had a bow, and I definitely wanted him to use it in our music because of the extra colors you can get by using that, which is a real advantage of the upright bass over the electric bass, by the way. And so I asked Ron McClure if he had any plans on using the bow. He says, well, if you want to see me use it, I'll use it. Just like that. So a few minutes later, go back inside. The band comes back for the second set, starts playing. And the very first bass solo on the first track, on the first song that they played in that particular set, Ron McClure pulls the bow out and plays the entire bass solo part using the bow, which is just real nice. He's just a real nice guy. So after that, I kind of went out of my way to seek out some of his albums. As a matter of fact, up on my page, and it goes back to well over a year ago, but I actually posted a Ron McClure album that he did as a leader that is there for everyone to hear, full of mostly, I think it's Ron McClure originals. But there is an album up on my Cosmic Pickle page that you will see that's a Ron McClure solo album. It's a trio. Again, it's a guitar trio with John Abercrombie, not John Schofield, but John Abercrombie playing guitar, and a drummer that I'm not really familiar with, but it's another interesting bass drums guitar album. And a Ron McClure-led solo album. And it's an excellent album, and like I said, I do have it in full up on my Cosmic Pickle page. You have to look for it. I posted it over a year ago. I didn't really realize at the time how much of a history that Ron McClure had as a jazz bassist, in addition to all these sessions that he obviously did. But apparently he actually studied at one point with Don Sebesky, who is my favorite jazz arranger, which is incredible. And Ron McClure actually played in Buddy Rich's band. Now, I'm a Buddy Rich fan, but most of my Buddy Rich albums actually started around 1966. And apparently McClure played with Buddy Rich around 1963, so just before I actually have material from that era. So I completely missed Ron McClure playing in Buddy Rich's band, but I'll rectify that certainly at some point in the future. The interesting thing that I also missed, I'm a big fan of the Wynton Kelly Trio. Wynton Kelly and his trio really came out of the Miles Davis group from the late 1950s, like 1959, 1960 period. Wynton Kelly, pianist, played with Miles Davis along with Paul Chambers on bass, and Jimmy Cobb on drums. And when they left Miles Davis, they formed a trio, and the three of them stayed together for quite a few albums. The same trio that had played with Miles Davis in the late 50s. And often that Wynton Kelly trio would support jazz guitarist Wes Montgomery. Well, at some point, Paul Chambers either wasn't available or he had left the Wynton Kelly trio at that point. Ron McClure actually filled in and played, which I was totally unaware of, and I have to wonder if any recordings exist of that period, because I've never seen them. The Wynton Kelly trio with Ron McClure instead of Paul Chambers. And then apparently, also, which I'm surprised I haven't come across, Ron McClure may have actually supported the Wynton Kelly trio, been in the Wynton Kelly trio when they played with played with Wes Montgomery. Interesting. Something else that I completely missed, and even though I know these people well, it's funny that it just didn't get in my memory. So in the late 60s, from 66 to 1969, Charles Lloyd, the saxophone player, had a very commercially successful jazz quartet. Actually kind of crossed over into pop music in terms of popularity. Like some of these records, I think it was like Forest Flower was the name of it. Some of these albums sold almost like pop music albums in the late 60s, these Charles Lloyd quartet albums. Now, I knew that at that time, drummer Jack DeJohnette was in the Charles Lloyd quartet. Pianist Keith Jarrett was in the Charles Lloyd quartet. Somehow it completely escaped me that Ron McClure was the bass player during that period. And now here's a really weird connection to my last album that I selected by Mike Knock. Apparently in the early 70s, Ron McClure actually played with Mike Knock in Mike Knock's band when he had a semi-jazz rock group called Fourth Way, which is that period that I was speaking about where Mike Knock did use some electric keyboards as well. And then Ron McClure did many sessions after that. But it's weird how I have this connection to the Mike Knock thing now, which is an album that I just randomly selected. And now I'm talking about Ron McClure. And, all of a sudden I discovered that he played with Mike Knock as well. Just incredible. And he played with Dave Liebman going on into the 70s and 80s. And Richie Byrock, the wonderful pianist. obviously played with Schofield, John Abercrombie, played with Paul Bley, Randy Brecker. I'm just doing this actually off of his Wikipedia page. I don't have all of this memorized. So Ron McClure, hell of a bass player. And one other story that I had to tell before I go is that shortly after seeing Schofield play and getting to talk to him, at the same time that the Shinola album came out, there was an album that came out really at the same time called 5 Years Later, which is a duet album with John Abercrombie and Ralph Towner. And both of those guys were living in New York City at the time. So I guess they would do occasional gigs together when they weren't necessarily doing a full-out tour, simply because they lived in the area and there was no logistics to setting up a tour. They would simply go home at the end of the gig. So 5 Years Later comes out roughly at the same time as the Shinola album. And roughly at the same time, John Abercrombie and Ralph Towner did this gig to support or promote the album in New York City. And Frank and I went. And at this club, they would do, like a lot of clubs, 2 shows a night. And we always got tickets for the later show. And so the first show was going on, and Frank and I are sitting just across the street. And this wasn't this is in the village, in Greenwich Village. So the streets weren't the big city streets that you're thinking of when you think of New York City. They were smaller streets. So just across the street, we're kind of sitting on a bench and hanging out and while the first show is going on of the Ralph Towner, John Abercrombie duet. We're just waiting for that one to let out so we could go in for the second show. And we happened to be sitting right across from us, a couple feet away from us, was a pay telephone. Now, at the time, early 1980s, nobody had cell phones. And we see this guy walk out of the club before the gig is up, before John Abercrombie and Ralph Towner are still playing, obviously. This guy walks out by himself, walks across the street, comes across the street to use the payphone. He's standing about 2 feet away from us. And I'm looking at it, and I'm like, holy crap, that's John Schofield. So I wait until he gets off the phone, and just as he's ready to walk back into the club, say, hey, John Schofield, and he turns around, and he's like, yeah. I said, oh, we just saw you a couple weeks ago and play in New Jersey. Real nice guy. And he said, are you going in there to see that, pointing to the club? And the Ralph Towner, John Abercrombie concert. He says, because they're really tearing it up in there, something like that. They're really, it's a really good gig, or, something along those lines. And we're like, yeah, well, we got tickets for the later show. He says, yeah, it's a great show. Just an all around nice guy. And then he just walked back into the club and watched the rest of the show. Very, very cool, very cool. So that's my little John Abercrombie tales. Okay, this is like the third time that I'm telling this story, so I really hope that this segment takes. The other 2 segments I can see came out okay, but one is a lot longer than the others. Keep your fingers crossed that I can sew this all together into a cohesive whole. And thanks for joining me, and sorry for going on as long. And once again, in the future, I will try to keep it down in terms of running length. And Halloween is upon us, so I've got, even a Halloween album out there, the Lights Out album from their old radio show. And favorite time of year, favorite season, favorite temperature, all that. So hope everybody's doing well. And I'll be back soon if the computer allows me to. Take care, everybody. Tune in next time for more
Tales from the Garage.